Okay, and I'll change my view. Okay, everyone. So we're going to pick up where we left off. We're in chapter 6, and we're going to pick up with verse 10, and that's on page 1027. 1027 in the ch8v10 Chumash. And here, remember that this is all part of a long speech that Moses makes to the people. Moses is, again, preparing to leave them, and in fact, to leave this earth. And this entire book of Deuteronomy is this speech. Much of it is legal. And we're going to see, not today, but within a session or two, just a whole series of laws which will be applicable once they come into the land. But here, Moses is preparing them for that, preparing them for the conquest, and reflecting on the challenges that they are going to face, the challenges not being what they think they will be. And I'll sort of leave that for the moment, and I'll explain it to you when we come to it. Okay, so again, we're on page 1027. It's chapter 6, beginning with verse 10. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that God swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to you, and then it goes on, great and flourishing cities that you did not build, houses full of all good things that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, you will eat your fill. So they are being brought into this wonderful place, this land flowing with milk and honey, and it is a land that has been completely built up. Not only are there great natural resources, but there are cities, there are storehouses full of grain, there are orchards and vineyards, and all of it is going to become theirs. But there's a fear, right? Take heed that you do not forget the Lord who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Revere only the Lord and worship God alone and swear only by his name. So there are two things. These are two things that Moses is worried about in terms of the people. And the first is, ironically, that things will be too good, right? That they will be so comfortable and so affluent that they'll forget all about God, that this will be a great threat to their relationship with God. It's ironic, right? But the idea is they won't be dependent anymore, right? They will appear to not need God. Unlike when they are in the wilderness and they are hungry and they're thirsty and only God can provide. But I think there's another element here too, and that is this idea: don't think you did it all yourselves, right? Don't think that do not forget that God freed you from the land of Egypt. We're going to see this even more explicitly a little later on. Don't say that my hand did this, right? I'm entitled. There is this sense of entitlement which can come from abundance and a forgetting of where that abundance came from. You know, there are those who argue that this is extremely relevant in the contemporary world, that the challenge of affluence, if you will, right? And the idea that, you know, I earned whatever I have. I'm entitled to it. It's mine. Not that it was a gift to me, right? So, you know, all these people who grow up with wealth and use that wealth to gain more wealth and then say it was all them, right? And anybody who doesn't have it, it's because they're lazy or weak or something else, right? So I think that message is here in part, this message that you'll be lulled into this idea that you'll forget where it comes from. You'll be ungrateful. And that will also lead you to another problem. Revere only the Lord your God and worship him and swear only by his name. Do not father other gods, the gods of the people around you. You might also be tempted to think, wow, look how beautiful this place is and look how much it has to offer. And let's think about the God who made all that possible. Because the Canaanites who had all this wealth and the other peoples there, they worshiped that God. And as a result, their land was very fertile. Maybe we should worship that God too. All right. So there's a dual challenge. The one challenge is the challenge of affluence, and the other challenge is the challenge of idolatry. But if you worship other gods, it's going to be a problem because God is impassioned. That is, God cares. This goes back even to the Ten Commandments. We talked about this relationship between God and the people as a kind of marital relationship, that idolatry is a betrayal of that marital covenant. And God's not going to put up with it. And if you do it, the anger of the Lord will blaze forth against you and wipe you out. So to continue on, do not try the Lord your God as you did at Massah. This was right after they came out of Egypt, and there was business about water and trying God over water. Rather, keep the commandments, decrees, and the laws that the Lord your God enjoins you. Do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it will go well with you, that you'll be able to possess the good land that the Lord your God promised on oath to your ancestors, and that all your enemies will be driven out before you, as the Lord has spoken. And now we come to a verse which should be very familiar. And if it isn't familiar, just wait a few weeks. Sitting at your Passover table, you will encounter this verse. Here it is. When in time to come, your children ask you, what mean the laws, the decrees, laws, and rules that the Lord our God has enjoined upon you? You shall say to your children, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us forth from Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and his household. And us God freed from there, that he might take us and give us the land that he promised on oath to our ancestors. Right? So this verse is really a reference back to the Exodus. And it's worth remembering that in terms of the language of the Bible, the Exodus from Egypt, which we will celebrate on Pesach, really has three main objectives. One is, of course, to bring the people from slavery to freedom. The second is to demonstrate God's power and majesty over the world, that no other gods, so-called gods, can stand up before gods. And in fact, each of the plagues can be seen as an attack on one of the gods that the Egyptians held dear, the Nile being worshipped, the sun being worshipped, and so we have the plague of darkness, and so on. So A, to get the people out of slavery, B, to demonstrate God's power, but C, to leave a lasting impression that will be traveled down through the generations, that in each generation, this event of the Exodus will be recalled. And so when your child asks you in the future, the Hebrew word here is mahar, which we usually think of as tomorrow, but the sense here is broader than that. What do these laws mean? You will tell your children we were slaves. So this reminds us, or it should remind us, of the so-called 4 questions at the Passover Seder, and the 4 children. And particularly the 4 children, because we talk about, we have this midrash, right, which takes verses from the Bible and attempts to create a kind of story or narrative out of them. 4 times in the Bible, we are told to tell our children about the Exodus from Egypt. And the rabbis construct this midrash as to say, why does it tell us 4 times? Because there are 4 different kinds of children. Or I would put it a little bit differently. There are 4 different kinds of learners, right? The idea is when you tell this story, you have to be aware of who you are telling it to, and you have to tell it to them in a way that will reach them. And so we have sophisticated learners, those who really want to probe into the details, and that is termed in the Midrash the Chacham, right, the wise child. And that seems to be this verse, right? What mean the decrees, laws, and statutes that the Lord our God has enjoined upon you, right? So it's asking a sophisticated question. It understands that there are different kinds of laws and so on. And the answer in the Haggadah is you should teach him all the laws, right down to the law about the Afikomen. That's not the answer here at all. The answer here is to tell a little bit of the story of the Exodus, except that we do have the words avadim hayinu, we were slaves, which itself becomes part of the Passover Seder and the Passover narrative, right? But what's important here is the sophistication of the question. There are 3 other places in the Torah which seems to invite this. One of those places is when you put the blood on the doorposts of your house, you and your child says, what is the meaning of this service, this practice? Maha avodah hazot lahem. What does this mean to you? Well, this is a child who's saying you and not him, and you have to, he is a child, a rebellious or a difficult child, and so you have to answer him in a certain way. Elsewhere in the Torah, it says, when your child says, what is this? Just what is this? Mazot? It's a simple child, simple question. Answer him in simple words. And finally, there's a 4th place in the Torah, which simply says, tell your child about the Exodus from Egypt. And it doesn't say when your child says this or that. So the rabbi who creates this midrash says, oh, that's a child who doesn't know how to ask, because there's no question, right? So all of this, and one of the reasons I'm sort of dwelling on this, not only because Passover is now less than a month away, which is terrifying in itself, but because Passover is less than a month away, we'll encounter these children or these learners. But it's also important to see how the Bible, the Torah in particular itself, becomes a kind of source book that is rated, right, or a storehouse, that when you want to put together the Haggadah, you take a verse from here, you take a verse from there, and so on. And we've seen this again and again when we look at the prayer book, not the least of which was when we looked at the Shema. Taken out of this context here becomes something that is said in the morning and in the evening. It's the first thing that children are taught. It's the last thing we are to say before we leave this earth, and so on. So all of these texts, which we study on their own, actually become the basis for a great deal more, sort of an unfolding into a very broad liturgical liturgy. Okay, I'm going to stop just for a minute and change the view. Any questions at this point? Anybody at all? Go ahead, Saul.
Yeah, I took out the Haggadah, and the part that you were just talking about does give the sources of these 4 children.
Yes, so probably in the Haggadah that you have, they're actually the chapters and verses, right?
Right.
It depends on the Haggadah, but yes, of course. Yeah, good. And Myra.
I apologize. When you started, I got a phone call. I just hit the page.
Oh, okay, so right now, we are on, we just finished, where is it here? Yeah, we're on page 1028. We were just reading at the middle of that page.
Thank you
Other-
very much. Sorry.
No problem, Sandy.
So Rabbi, in the beginning from today, when you were talking about when you get into the land and you have all these good things, which you didn't do this, you didn't do that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm just surprised that it doesn't say something to the effect of it's because of the merit of your ancestors.
It's coming. It's definitely coming.
Okay.
And we'll see it, and thank you. And not the ancestors, but particularly Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because God swore an oath. Right? And that theme of God had made this promise about their descendants will recur here again and again.
Okay, thank you.
So wait for it. You won't be disappointed, Barry.
Yes, I've long had the problem with the 4 sons or the 4 children in the Haggadah. So the explanation makes a big deal about whether the references to you, the people, if you excludes himself or includes himself. So,
Yes.
I mean, in this version, it says that here it says that the laws. The Lord our God has commanded you.
Yes. Yes.
So it would
So,
seem to be
right. So the
one
whole thing,
interpretation here is that
right?
he excludes
It's
himself.
right. It's a great question. In other words, we dump on the Russia, right? Because he says, "What is the meaning of this to you? By you, he excludes himself, etc."
Right.
But here, the wise child, right, is asking, "What are these laws and statutes, etc., to you?" Right? And he gets a pass. Right? It's a great question. So there are two ways of dealing with this. The first is that if you look at the ancient translation, the ancient Greek translation of the Torah, which is known as the Septuagint, right? It actually there doesn't say you, it says us. When they translated it. And so you could simply say, well, the author of this midrash knew that version and knew it in Greek and didn't pay so much attention to the Hebrew. But I think even if we want to say that this text was the text that was used, it's all about tone of voice. You know, the question is, is it coming in humility? God commanded you, and I don't even know if I'm worthy of that kind of commandment. Or is it a sneer? Is it a put down? And you, I have nothing to do with that. This is your primitive ritual, right? And remember that in its original context, they're talking about putting the blood on the doorposts, right? But it's a great question, and it's interesting that, as you say, both the wicked and the wise, right, seem to say the same thing, but the implications are very different. So thanks for the question. Anything else before we go on? Seeing nothing, let me change the view back. Okay, so we are going to, and the Lord wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and his household, and he freed us from there that he may give us the land that, and here it is, he promised on oath to our fathers. Then the Lord commanded us to observe these laws, to revere the Lord our God for our lasting good and for our survival, as is now the case. And it will be therefore to our merit before the Lord our God to observe faithfully this whole instruction. In the Hebrew, it's kol ha-mitzvah hazot. The word mitzvah here is being used in the broadest possible sense, this whole mitzvah. That is to say, all of that God has enjoined us before God as God has commanded. And now we're going to come back again to this fear that Moses has. And one of the things you could say about Deuteronomy is it's kind of repetitive, right? Moses keeps saying the same kind of thing in different words again and again. Moses is really here at the end of his life. He's going to be leaving the people. He's worried about them. He has a message for them. He doesn't want them to forget what he has to say. And so part of what Moses is doing here is pounding it in, wants to be sure they get it. When the Lord your God brings to the land that you are about to enter possess, and God dislodges many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgazites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations much larger than you, and the Lord your God delivers them to you to defeat them. You must doom them to destruction, grant no terms, give no quarter. You shall, and then it goes on, don't intermarry, and so on. But I'm just going to skip that for a moment, come back to it. Instead, this is what you should do to them. Tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred posts, consign their images to the fire, right? So you're supposed to go in and both wipe out the people physically and destroy any remains of their culture, which is very harsh and very difficult, I think. I think there is a sense here, and now I'll go back. Don't intermarry them, give their daughters, your daughters to their sons, take their daughters for your sons. There is this sense, and we've seen it before again and again in the Torah, that they will tempt you out of this relationship with God. That the remnants of pagan culture will be there to lure you, and that there is a sense here that paganism is enormously enticing, that the people are liable to really fall into it, and radical means have to be taken to protect the people from violating the covenant, which will then lead God to destroy them. However, it still doesn't sit well. And I want to take you back for a moment. I'm going to save this place. And let's go all the way back to the book of Genesis, chapter 15. Because I think in order to understand this, at least part of it, we have to look, and particularly at one verse. So, chapter 15, this is after Abraham, then known as Abram, right, has fought a war in order to save his nephew Lot, who had been taken captive. And sometime after that, God says to him, don't be afraid, I'll be a shield for you. Your reward will be great. And Abraham says, well, great, but I won't even have children. So let's make domestic Eliezer, who is my steward, he'll become my heir. And since you haven't given me any offspring, and the word of the Lord came to him in reply, no one else shall be your heir but your own issue. And then we get this. He takes him outside. He says, look to the heaven, count the stars, so shall be your offspring. And then he said to him, and now here, this is God speaking to Moses, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur to assign this land to you as a possession. And so this is God's affirming a promise to give the land of Israel to Abraham and his descendants. And we have a little ritual, which is a kind of sealing of this covenant, right? And Abraham goes into a trance, and God says, know well that your offspring will be strangers in a land they're not theirs. They'll be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they will serve, and in the end, they will go free with great wealth. As for you, you'll go down to your fathers in peace and be buried at a ripe old age, right? So later on, your children are going to suffer in slavery, but you actually will not see that. And then I'll give them the land. And why not? Look at verse 16. They will return here in the fourth generation, that is the descendants of Abraham, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. I cannot give you the land now, Abraham seems to be saying, because the inhabitants of the land have not done evil to such an extent that I can justify taking the land away from them and giving it to you. Right? So there are two things that are going on here. One is that the Jewish people, Abraham's descendants, are a special people. We're going to see language about that, language where we talk about the people of Israel as God's special treasure and other similar things. But the other is that God's not going to take this land away from the inhabitants who were there until the time is right. And that means that Abraham, though he will die in peace, will not get to see the fulfillment of this pledge for hundreds of years. So I think in part, and maybe I just would like to think about it this way, but in part, I think that one has to see the harshness of the treatment of the native peoples as something that is a deserved punishment from God. Remember also that the people of Israel are being told the same thing would happen to them. There is a sense in which this land in particular is a holy land that cannot tolerate immorality. And therefore, just as the Canaanites are dispossessed, there is a warning, and we'll see it again and again, that the same thing can happen to you. All right. However, having said that, this is what they're supposed to do. And now I'm back on page 1030, and I'm picking up again from verse 6.
Rabbi,
You
could I
are-
ask something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is this fourth generation a theme? I'm just
Yeah,
wondering. I didn't.
yeah, so it's really unclear what fourth generation means, since, how many years are in a generation. I don't quite know what to make of the use of the word generation. We're told about, the number of generations between Adam and Noah, and then the number of generations between Noah and Abraham. I don't know. I really don't know. I'll leave it there. But it's a good question. Okay. Back on page 1030. All right. So you are a people consecrated to the Lord, and you look at the Hebrew, ki am kadosh ata. Kadosh, holy, right? The translation here is consecrated, but the basic sense of it is you're a holy people. So what does it mean to be holy in the Bible? Doesn't mean something that should be worshipped, right? You're not a people that is meant to be worshipped. Holy fundamentally means separate, separated out. You could even say elevated, right? But the idea is made distinct from others, given a special status. So, for example, the Shabbat is a Yom Kodesh, right? A holy day. Why? Because it's separated out from the rest of the week. Doesn't have the same status. It's not in the same place. It is that separation, essentially, which confers holiness onto something. It's interesting. The opposite of Kodesh is Chol, right? And Chol in Hebrew just means mixed together, unspecified, amorphic, right? As opposed to Kodesh, which is elevated and specified. So you are an kadosh to God. God has chosen you to be an sigula. So the word sigula here it's translated as treasured, right? Something special, something that God dotes on, right? So not just separated out. It's not just that you're in a different position, but that God takes delight in you. Right? I think that would be a sense of the nuance here of being segula from all the other peoples who are on the face of the earth. Right? So Israel has a special relationship. God delights in Israel, and as a result, they have both the gift and the burden of having to follow certain laws, which other people don't have to follow. Right? There is, I mean, we often talk about, or we think that being chosen means being special, but it also means special obligations. Give you an example of that, right? We think about how Israel can be divided into groups, the people of Israel, right? Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, right? Priests, the Levites, and the rest of the people. But priest is an elevated role. But actually, it means there are certain things you can do and certain things you can't do that every other Israelite can do, right? So with elevation, with separation, also comes additional responsibilities. Right? Jews have to keep kosher. Other non-Jews don't have to keep kosher. And there's nothing wrong with not keeping kosher. It's just something, if you're going to be in this special group, it's part of what you have to do, at least from the point of view of the Torah. Okay. And then Moses goes on to say, it's not because you're the most numerous of people that God has chosen you. Indeed, you're the smallest of people. It is because the Lord favored you and kept the oath he made to your ancestors. There you go again with this idea of the oath and the ancestors, right? And because of that, even though you were small, even though you were kind of insignificant, right? And part of that sense of being small or insignificant is that this really becomes, it's not that God relishes the mighty and the powerful, right? Which is an idea that was pretty prevalent in antiquity, right? God is on the side of the mighty armies, right? And not these little people who are easily vanquished. No, you're the smallest. It doesn't matter. Size doesn't count. What counts is that you are the descendants of people with whom God has made an oath to take you out of the house of bondage. Therefore, know, only the Lord your God is God, right? He is Hu Ha-Elohim. Adonai Elohecha Hu Ha-Elohim. Right? He is God, that is to say, and what does that mean? He is El Ne'eman, steadfast God, a God who will be the same, who will always be there for you, keeps his faithful covenant faithfully to the thousands generations of those who love him and keep his commandments, but instantly requites with destruction those who reject him, never slow with those who reject them, requiting them instantly. Therefore, observe this instruction. Now, actually, we saw that it doesn't, elsewhere when it talks about that, doesn't say it so instant. But I think here part of what Moses's rhetoric is meant to do is to tell them, better watch out. God is there for 1,000 generations, but if you blow it, it's going to be the end. It's going to happen. And I think this is more rhetoric than theology, frankly, as Moses is trying very hard to get the people to kind of scare them straight, to get them to understand this great gift and privilege that they have, which they should not take for granted, and that the consequences of doing that are going to be dire and immediate. Okay, well, we've come to the end of Parshat Ve'etchana. So we're going to jump ahead, just skip over the Haftorah if you're in the Eitz Chaim, and we'll go right to Ekev. And here in Ekev, we're going to begin with, again, this notion of reward and punishment. It's going to be very good for you, assuming that you do what God wants you to do. You'll have all of these magnificent benefits. But if not, it's implied here, but later on we're going to see it quite explicitly. The consequences of not obeying are also going to be dire. But what we have here is a very lush description of the good things that will come to you. If you do obey these laws and observe them carefully, the Lord your God will maintain faithfully for you the covenant that God made as an oath with your ancestors. God will favor you, bless you, multiply you. He will bless the issue of your womb and produce of your soil, your new grain and white and wine and oil, the calving of your herd, the lambing of your flock in the land that the Lord swore your ancestors to assign you. You'll be blessed among all peoples. There shall be no sterile male or female among your livestock. God will ward off from you all sickness. He will not bring on any of the dreadful diseases of Egypt about which you know, but will inflict them on your enemies. You will destroy all the peoples that the Lord your God delivers you, showing them no pity. You won't worship their gods, for they would be a snare to you. Should you say to yourself, these nations are more numerous than we, how can we possess them? You have no fear of them. You have to bear in mind the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, the wondrous acts you saw with your own eyes, the signs, the portents, the mighty hand, the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God liberated you. Thus the Lord will do to all these people you now fear. The Lord your God will send a plague against them until those left in hiding perish before you. Do not stand in dread of them, for the Lord your God is in your midst, a great and awesome God. The Lord your God will dislodge these people little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them at once, lest wild beasts will multiply to your hurt. The Lord your God will deliver them to you, throwing them into utter panic until they are wiped out. You will deliver their kings into your hand. You will obliterate their name from under heaven. No man will stand up to you. And you will consign the images of their gods to the fire. You shouldn't covet the silver and gold and keep it for yourselves, lest you be ensnared by them, for that is abhorrent to the Lord your God. You must not bring an abhorrent house into your house, or you will be prescribed like it. You must reject it as abominable and abhorrent, where it is prescribed. Okay, so great things will happen to you as long as you're faithful. You'll be able to conquer the land. Don't be afraid. You're a little people, not a problem. God is going to be with you, but make sure that you destroy anything that has to do with the Canaanites, because it will entrap you, even to the extent of taking the gold and silver and bringing it into God's house. That in itself would be a problem. There's something almost tainted even about the raw materials. So everything's going to be great. Don't worry about your enemies. Just do what I tell you. That's sort of the message here. And we'll move on just a little bit. Chapter 8, you should faithfully observe all the instructions that I enjoin you, that you may thrive, increase, be able to possess the land. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has made you travel in a wilderness these 40 years, that God may test you by hardships to learn what was in your hearts, whether you'll keep his commands or not. So this is an interesting kind of rereading of now Moses looking back on the wilderness experience. Why were the people led through this wilderness for 40 years? Well, we know about the scouts and all of that, but this was really a period of trying the people, testing them. And I think part of the image here is almost refining them, like separating the dross from the silver to purify it, right? And it's interesting because often we think of the wilderness period and our tradition and the Psalms in particular talk about it as a time when we tested God. God tested Abraham, and then Abraham's descendants now test God. But no, the suggestion here is this was to test us and teach us. God subjected you to hardship of hunger, and then gave you manna to eat, which neither you nor your fathers had ever known, in order to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but man may live on anything that the Lord decrees. So why did God let them get hungry? If you think about the story, right? So they get really hungry and they go and they complain, and Moses, and then God says, okay, I'll send them manna. Right? But why didn't they send the manna to begin with? Why did they have to go? Why the thirst, right? Why does he lead them through this place where they're going to suffer all these privations and then give them the antidote, right? So Moses is reflecting back here, and he's trying to understand it as a kind of a test and a teaching opportunity. So the manna, something really extraordinary and unique. Not like anything that had ever occurred on earth before, something that their ancestors had never known. And why is the manna a test? To see if they will follow the rules? Well, remember, the peculiar thing about manna was it fell every day except Shabbat, and every day you collected your daily bread, as it were. And then whatever you didn't take would rot. And if you took more than you needed, it would rot. You couldn't store it up. You couldn't save it. And then on Fridays, you got a double portion, and that didn't rot, so that the next day you'd have enough for all of Shabbat, right? So all of that is about training and teaching. And we have the story of people who went out on Wednesday and they collected manna, and they collected well more than they needed, right? And it rotted. Right? So there's a sense in which there's a dependence on God, and then also an insistence on following the rules. And the manna itself becomes a kind of teaching opportunity. But there's more than that. And by the way, this is that famous phrase, right? Man does not live by bread alone. In this case, we often talk about it as, oh yeah, we need more than just physical substance. But here it's really talking about manna, not just bread. God can create something miraculous. And the clothes that you wore did not wear out, and your feet did not swell these 40 years, right? You were so well taken care of that your clothing was well kept. Bear in mind that the Lord your God disciplines you as a man disciplines his son, right? So this relationship is not only marital, right? It's also parental. You know that old expression when a parent disciplines their child, and in the old days that was physical. Son, this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. Right? May or may not be true. But the idea here was really that it's an obligation of a parent to discipline their child so that they will grow up right. And God is parental in this way. And therefore, keep the covenant, following God's ways, Lalechet bidrachav, that you should walk in God's ways and revere him. And then we get this great statement. The Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains, issuing from plain and hill, a land of wheat, barley, vines, figs, pomegranates, olive trees, and honey, a land where you may eat food without stint, where you will lack nothing, a land whose rocks are iron, and from whose hills you can mine copper. It's the ideal place. And then we get this statement. When you have eaten your fill, give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which God has given. Now, in terms of the narrative here, it's like God's going to give you great stuff. You're going to be able to enjoy it and thank God for it. But this becomes the basis for a very well-known central Jewish ritual that takes place daily, several times a day, which is Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. If you look at the verse, V'achalta, you should eat, v'savata, and you should be satisfied, uveirachta, and you should bless Adonai Elohecha on the land. Right? So in its context, this is all about being in the land of Israel. But what the rabbis do, first of all, it's striking, right? It's after you're full. If you look at grace in general and the way grace is generally done, if you are with a family that says grace or at a communal gathering, and we're following a kind of Christian model, it's the beginning. Right? It's the beginning. Thank you, God, for what we are about to eat. It's that. We do that in a very minor way, right? We'll say, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, for example. Blessed are you who brings forth bread from the earth. But in the Jewish tradition, the real grace is after the meal. It comes from eating and enjoying, and then out of that sense of enjoyment and satisfaction, being moved to thank God. And what do we thank God for? Here, it's the land. And so if you look at Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, it actually has 3 separate blessings. I mean, it's longer than that, but there are 3 times in it that we say, Baruch Atah Adonai, right? 3 blessings. The first one is that you feed everyone. Chazana Takol. And by the way, that's not just people, right? We thank God for being the provider of nourishment to the world. And we also, though, have a second blessing, and where we thank God for the land and the food, right? So the idea is whatever we're eating and wherever we are, when we finish, we're also thanking God for the land of Israel. In its original context here, that was about people living in the land of Israel, enjoying its bounty, thanking God for that. But the rabbis and the Jewish tradition really grows up outside the land of Israel. And the Talmud, at least the one we know, not the Jerusalem Talmud was very short, but the basic Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, is all outside the land of Israel. And it is those rabbis not in the land of Israel who take this verse and universalize it. So it's not just Jews in the land, but they are also saying, in effect, wherever I'm eating, thank God for Israel. Thank God for that land, in addition to thanking God for the food that we eat. And then we actually also ask God to restore. The third blessing, we ask God to restore the people to the land, and particularly to build up Jerusalem. Okay, this is a good place to stop. We have a few more minutes, and I'm going to open it up and welcome your questions or comments. Anything at all in terms of what we've looked at today? Francesca.
Hi. So it's sort of a semi-question, semi-comment.
Sure.
I'm very impressed with how, if we're taking the parenting suggestion that you're proposing, that God seems to be a very punitive parent. He seems to be extremely revengeful. And then the other phrase that keeps coming in my head is, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. So where does all this fit in? I thought God is supposed to be loving and etc.
Okay.
And I understand about
so
blessings.
you ask a great question, right? So I would say that God has two sides, right?
Oops.
And we often talk about God as being just and God as being merciful. Right?
Yes.
And those are two sides, right? There is a sense God is a stern parent, right? Who punishes a child for their own good, right? But God is also a loving parent who forgives, right? Forgives pretty much unconditionally. God, even when the people do, everything they do, so much so that the land is destroyed. They allow, God allows the Babylonians and then the Romans to come and to destroy the land and the temple and to exile the people. God never gives up, right? And that's the message of the Torah, ever, right? And when they go into exile, God goes with them into exile, and God is with them, and weeps for them and empathizes with them. So yes, I think the image here is of a strict parent, but there's also this sense of, undying love and forgiveness, which goes along with it. And then the other one, love has what hell has no fury like a woman scorned, is that yes, that's part of having a relationship and an exclusive relationship. And that's what God is asking for here, right? This is a marital relationship, is that God can be hurt. God is allowing God's self, in a sense, to be very vulnerable. Right? God cares, right? And out of that vulnerability comes a sense of, hurt, vulnerability, which leads to, very negative emotions vis-a-vis the people. One of the things that I think is striking about this is how different this is from the kind of Greco-Roman conception, and particularly the philosophical conception as God as sort of remote, the first actor, the one who doesn't feel things. God in the Torah really feels things, feels them deeply, is more human in that sense and less abstract. God is also someone who learns over time. It's striking to me that we have this image of God, the flood, it's terrible, these people, they're awful, and God floods the earth, wipes out that generation, just keeps Noah and his family alive to perpetuate the human race. And then the Torah says God regrets it and vows never to do it again. Puts the bow in the sky. God seems to have learned from this. God's relationship with Moses is one of learning on both sides. Moses pleads with God, and God listens to Moses and accedes to what he wants. So I would say that God here is very complex.
As
and
are
yes,
all relationships.
There are echoes of in terms of harshness, sure, but like human beings here in the Torah, God is quite complex. Anything else?
Thank you.
Before we have, Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't quite get the third blessing from Birkat Hamazon. What aspect?
Uvenei Yerushalayim Era Kodesh B'Marav Baruch Bonei Yerushalayim, I think is, if you take a look at it, it's about rebuilding Jerusalem.
Right. Okay.
Which first so you could see it as kind of moving from the general to the specific. First, we thank God for feeding everything and everyone. Then we thank God specifically for the land. And ultimately, we talk about rebuilding Jerusalem, which is really about redemption, right? Because Jerusalem being rebuilt is about the Messianic Torah, and we're really asking for that in a sense. Other comments, Sandy, and then
No,
Barry.
by the way, I'm reading a book right now called God, a biography by, I think it's Jack Miles.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
okay, good. Thanks for mentioning it.
Yeah, and
Barry?
I had a question.
Oh, you have a question, go ahead.
You go.
Sorry. So back in Genesis, when you went back to that reference in Genesis, and it says that, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. I got confused, and I thought that the Egyptian affliction was 290, and the
Yes.
rest was being outside the land. But here it says afflict. What is
No,
that?
there are different statements in the Torah for how long this is. And one way of looking at it as well was originally supposed to be 400 years, but God actually shortened it, and here's why. It's complicated. I'm not going to go in, but yes, this seems to be the maximum view. And in fact, we have shortening of it, considerable shortening of it. Remember also, and I'll just, that 400 is a symbolic number.
Mhm.
Just as 40 days and 40 nights, 40 years in the wilderness. So one has to look, it shouldn't take these numbers so literally, because they're used in a literary way. There was somebody else. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, I'm just gonna throw out a thought for now. Just imagine that God is looking at the Jewish people today. What would He make of us? And He can even narrow that down. What would He make of the people in Israel today? Because it's very much mixed in terms of following the laws.
Yes. Yeah.
And does He punish everyone because of
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I will say only this about, I have no idea what God. But remember that the Torah is only one lens. And in fact, much of what we call of Judaism and how we think about God really comes through the refraction of the rabbinic period. So in order to, at least from a Jewish point of view, in order to consider questions like that, you have to look not just at the Torah, but more broadly. On the other hand, I find it impossible to know what God would think. I have enough trouble figuring out what I think, which right now is deeply concerned about what's going on in Israel, deeply concerned. Okay, everybody, we are out of time. We continue next week. I look forward to seeing you then. I'll get the recording out, and so 2 things. First of all, if you're interested, I am speaking at the synagogue I go to this Shabbat, which is B'nai Shalom in West Orange, New Jersey. And if you're interested, it'll be up on their YouTube feed this Saturday. The other is that I want to mention, I have dropping next week. You just did, I think, a really interesting episode of my podcast with my friend, the Episcopal priest, and we talked about evangelism, what Christians talk about when they talk about trying to reach out to people of other faiths and bring them in. And I talked about it from a Jewish point of view, and it's a really interesting conversation. And you might want to check it out along with the other podcasts that we've done. We just did one on anti-Semitism, and I just think there's a lot of stuff there, so you might like it. In the meantime, I'm going to say, see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you very much.
you.
Bye.